And how much worse could this night get before it was over? The air was thick with tension. Every second that passed felt stretched, like a rope pulled too tight, ready to snap. The wedding guests weren't just watching anymore. They were waiting, holding their breath, expecting something to happen. No one knew what, but everyone could feel it. The officers, the family, the bride with tears streaking her face. It was a moment frozen in time, teetering on the edge of something bigger. James' wrists ached from the tight cuffs, but he barely noticed. His focus was on the lead officer, the one who was now shifting uncomfortably under the weight of dozens of eyes, dozens of cameras recording every move. The situation had escalated beyond what they expected. Maybe they thought they could handle this quietly, get in, make the arrest, leave without pushback. But now there was no easy way out. Michelle stepped even closer, her voice sharp. "If you don't release him now, you'll have a lawsuit before the night is over. You'll have to explain why you arrested a federal agent, without cause, in front of multiple witnesses and live recordings." She tilted her head slightly. "I hope your department is ready for that kind of attention." The younger officer shifted on his feet, clearly nervous now. He glanced at his superior, waiting for a response, but the lead officer's face remained unreadable. He was stalling. Then the sound of approaching sirens cut through the night. Another set of flashing lights appeared down the street. Another vehicle. This time, not just a patrol car, something bigger. A black SUV rolled to a stop. The doors opened, and two men in suits stepped out. Their presence alone changed everything. They weren't local police. They weren't regular law enforcement. These were federal agents. The crowd murmured, the tension twisting into something new, uncertainty. Even the officers looked surprised. The lead officer straightened up, clearly realizing he might be in over his head. One of the agents, a tall man with sharp eyes, stepped forward, pulling out his credentials. Special Agent Richardson, Department of Justice. His tone was controlled but firm. "We need to have a conversation. Now." The lead officer hesitated, then nodded stiffly. "We were responding to a suspect match." Richardson didn't blink. "You're detaining a CIA operative at a private event without evidence. Do you have an arrest warrant?" The officer didn't answer. The silence stretched too long. That was all the confirmation Richardson needed. The other agent turned to James, his expression unreadable. "Are you injured?" James gave a small shake of his head. He was fine, physically at least. Richardson looked back at the lead officer. "You're going to remove those cuffs." A flicker of resistance flashed across the officer's face, but he knew he had no choice. The cameras were on. The DOG was here. The pressure was mounting from every side. Slowly, almost reluctantly, he stepped forward and unlocked the cuffs. James exhaled as he pulled his arms forward, rubbing his sore wrists. He stood up slowly, not saying a word, but locking eyes with the man who had just humiliated him in front of his family. The tension wasn't gone. If anything, it was worse now, because this wasn't over. Not yet. James flexed his wrists, feeling the burn where the cuffs had been. The moment should have felt like a victory. He was free. The officers had been forced to back down. The DOG was here, watching everything, but something still wasn't right. You could feel it in his gut. The way the lead officer avoided eye contact. The tension in the air that hadn't eased, even with his release. This wasn't just a mistake. It was something bigger. Richardson turned to the officers, his expression unreadable. "I want to see the original report that led to this arrest. Now." The lead officer hesitated. His hand twitched toward his radio, then stopped. He was caught, and he knew it. If he admitted they had nothing solid, it could mean serious trouble. But if he kept pushing, it could be worse. Then, before he could answer, his radio crackled to life. "All units, we have an update on the suspect description," a voice came through. "Correction on height and build. Suspect is 6'4", approximately 250 pounds. Armed and last seen near." The voice cut off suddenly, as if someone had silenced it on purpose. James' stomach dropped. He wasn't 6'4". He wasn't 250 pounds. He wasn't even close. And yet, they still tackled him, still threw him to the ground, still cuffed him in front of his family. The pieces weren't adding up. The younger officer took a half step back. He had heard it too. His eyes darted between James and his superior, like he was putting the puzzle together in real time. It all started on a regular afternoon, the kind of day when nothing seems out of the ordinary, until everything changes in an instant. The street was busy, cars rolling by, people walking past, lost in their own worlds. But in the middle of it all, a scene was unfolding that would soon turn the entire city upside down. A black man stood on the sidewalk, dressed in a simple button-up shirt and slacks, scrolling through his phone. He wasn't doing anything wrong, wasn't causing trouble, wasn't disturbing anyone. But to a group of officers cruising down the street, he looked suspicious. Maybe it was the way he carried himself, maybe it was just the color of his skin. Whatever it was, they decided they had to stop him. The flashing lights came on. The siren let out a sharp, piercing wail. Within seconds, 3 officers jumped out of their patrol car, moving fast, hands already reaching for their belts. "Hey, you. Hands where we can see them," one officer barked. The man barely had time to react before another officer grabbed his arm. Confusion flickered across his face. "What's going on?" he asked, his voice calm but firm. "We'll ask the questions," another officer snapped. "Turn around." Before he could say anything else, his arms were yanked behind his back. Cold steel handcuffs clamped around his wrists. A small crowd began to gather, passers-by slowing down, pulling out their phones, watching as the officers roughly pushed him against the hood of the patrol car. "Do you have any weapons? Drugs on you? Why are you out here?" The man took a deep breath, his patience steady even as people in the crowd murmured in disbelief. "I don't have anything on me," he said evenly. "What crime do you think I committed?" "You fit the description," one of the officers shot back. "We got a call about a suspect in the area." But he didn't match any description. There had been no real call. They had seen him, made an assumption, and now they were treating him like a criminal in broad daylight. By now the tension in the air was thick. Someone in the crowd called out, "You'll know who that is." One of the officers shot them a sharp glance. "Step back," he ordered. "This is police business." The murmuring grew louder. People were shaking their heads. The officers weren't paying attention to the shift in the crowd's energy. They were too busy shoving their suspect into the back of the squad car, too caught up in their authority to notice the disbelief on people's faces. And then, just as one of them reached for the radio to call it in, the man in handcuffs spoke again. This time, his voice carrying a weight that made the officers pause. "You're making a big mistake," he said, locking eyes with the one standing closest to him. "Oh yeah," the officer scoffed. "And why's that?" The man's lips curled into something that wasn't quite a smile. He leaned forward slightly, just enough for his next words to land like a thunderclap. "Because I'm your new boss." Silence. The officers exchanged glances, their confidence faltering for the first time. A nervous chuckle escaped from one of them, as if he thought this was some kind of joke, but the look in the man's eyes said otherwise. Someone in the crowd spoke again, louder this time. "That's the new sheriff." The realization hit like a freight train. The officers' faces drained of color as the truth sank in. The man they had humiliated, arrested, and manhandled in front of all these witnesses was their new police sheriff. And just like that, the power dynamic flipped. What happens next? Stay tuned. For a moment, everything seemed frozen in time. The crowd stood still, their murmurs turning into stunned silence. The officers, who just seconds ago were so sure of their authority, now looked at each other, searching for some kind of explanation, some way to make sense of what they had just heard. The man in handcuffs, *, new sheriff, watched them carefully, his expression unreadable. He wasn't angry. He wasn't shouting or demanding anything. He just sat there waiting, watching as they processed their mistake. One of the officers, a tall man with a square jaw, took a cautious step back. "Wait," he muttered under his breath, his voice suddenly lacking the sharp confidence it had before. "That can't be right." But the crowd knew it was. People started pulling out their phones, looking up his name, murmuring confirmation to one another. Some had already recognized him, but now the news spread like wildfire. "That's him," someone said. "He just got sworn in last week." A woman near the front of the crowd shook her head in disbelief, and they just threw him in cuffs like he was a nobody. The officers must have heard that, but they didn't respond. They were still trying to figure out what to do, how to undo what had just happened. He turned, facing his own men. For too long, this department has operated in the shadows. People have been silenced. Cases have been buried. And the ones responsible have never been held accountable. He let his gaze land on the young officer, then the captain, then the sergeant. "That changes today." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Then the sheriff pulled something from his pocket, a flash drive. He held it up for everyone to see. "This contains the leaked files." His voice was steady. "And I know exactly who's been feeding them to the press." The chief of staff stiffened. The officers exchanged glances. Even the protesters leaned in. The sheriff turned and pointed, straight at the captain. The room exploded with reactions. The captain's face drained of color. "What?" "You've been here for over 20 years, the sheriff said. "You've seen every cover-up, every bad call, every corrupt officer who got promoted instead of punished." His voice didn't waver. "And I know that somewhere along the way, you started feeding this information to the media. Maybe it was guilt. Maybe you just wanted to burn it all down. But I checked the files. Only someone in your position could have had access to all of this." The captain's hands curled into fists. "You don't have proof." The sheriff tilted his head. "Then you won't mind me turning this over to internal affairs." For a long moment, no one spoke. The captain's breathing was heavy, his eyes darting around the room. Then finally, his shoulders sagged. "This department is broken," he muttered, "and you think you can fix it. But you don't understand. This entire system is designed to protect itself. You can't fight it." The sheriff took a slow step forward. "Watch me." 2 officers moved in, placing the captain in cuffs. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. The young officer who had arrested the sheriff earlier watched in stunned silence. He had thought the sheriff was just another suit, another politician pretending to be a cop. But now he wasn't so sure. The crowd outside had grown louder, their voices ringing through the precinct walls. The city was demanding justice, and for the first time in years, it felt like they might actually get it. As the captain was led away, the sheriff turned back to his men. "This is the moment everything changes," he said. "You have a choice. You can be part of the problem, or you can be part of the solution." No one spoke, but the air had shifted. The fight wasn't over. There were still battles ahead, more corruption to root out, more trust to rebuild. But tonight, a message had been sent, and the city was watching. The precinct was still buzzing long after the captain was led away. Officers whispered among themselves, trying to process what had just happened. Some looked shaken, others relieved. A few even seemed hopeful. The weight that had pressed down on the department for years had finally cracked, and for the first time, there was a chance, just a chance, that things might actually change. The sheriff stood in the center of it all, his face unreadable. He knew this wasn't the end. Exposing the captain was one thing, but dismantling the culture that had allowed all of this to happen, that was a much bigger fight, a longer one, but he had made his choice, and he wasn't backing down. The young officer who had arrested him earlier stood off to the side, his arms crossed. He wasn't smirking anymore. He wasn't mocking. If anything, he looked conflicted. He stepped forward, hesitating before speaking. "So what now?" His voice was quieter than before, less certain. The sheriff met his gaze. "Now," he said, "we do the job the right way." The young officer exhaled, shaking his head. And if people don't like that? The sheriff gave a small, tired smile. Then they can leave. The officer didn't say anything, but something in his face shifted. Maybe, just maybe, he was beginning to see things differently. Outside, the crowd was still there. The news cameras were rolling. Protesters stood with signs, their voices filling the night air. But when the sheriff stepped outside, something happened. They quieted, not completely, but just enough. Enough to listen. The sheriff took a deep breath. "I know what you're all thinking," he said, his voice steady. "And I don't blame you." He looked over the faces in the crowd, faces filled with frustration, exhaustion, and a desperate need for things to be different. "You don't trust us. And after everything that's happened, why should you?" A few people nodded, murmuring in agreement. Others crossed their arms, waiting to hear more. A ripple of murmurs moved through the crowd. People nodded, whispered, shot glances at the officers who had once carried themselves like they owned the street. Now, they looked small. The captain's jaw tightened. You could already hear the fallout in his head. Internal affairs, reporters, public outrage. The sheriff wasn't just anyone. He was the man the city had brought in to change things, to fix a department drowning in bad headlines and lawsuits. And now, his own officers had just handed him the perfect case study. The sheriff folded his arms. "Here's my question, Captain. What happens next?" The captain hesitated. He had spent years protecting his men, covering for them when things got messy. But this wasn't something he could sweep under the rug. Not with cameras rolling, not with the sheriff staring him down. Before he could answer, another voice cut through the air. "This isn't the first time they've done this." The crowd parted slightly, revealing a middle-aged man in a work uniform. He stepped forward, his face lined with frustration. 3 months ago, they'd pulled me over for a busted taillight, he said, his voice steady. Ended up with me face down on the pavement because I looked nervous. Another person spoke up, a woman clutching a grocery bag. "They stopped my son last week. He was walking home from school." More voices joined in. A pattern began to form. It wasn't just this one moment. This wasn't just about the sheriff. This was about something bigger, something deeper. The sheriff listened, his expression unreadable, but his eyes were sharp, taking in every story. He had suspected as much. He had read the reports, seen the complaints that had been quietly filed away. But standing here, hearing it firsthand, it was different. The captain rubbed his temple, realizing there was no easy way out of this. His officers weren't just answering for one mistake anymore. They were answering for all of them. The younger officer, still standing stiffly, finally cracked. "We were just trying to do our jobs," he muttered. The sheriff let out a quiet, humorless chuckle. "Your job," he repeated. Then his voice hardened. "Your job is to serve this community, not terrorize it." Silence. The crowd murmured in agreement, shifting closer. The officers, outnumbered not by force but by truth, stood frozen. The sheriff looked at them one by one. He could see it now, the fear creeping in, the realization that their badges didn't shield them from consequences anymore. "This conversation isn't over," he said finally, turning to the captain. "But I'll tell you this, you wanted change. You got it." He turned back to the crowd, nodding toward them, silently acknowledging their stories. Then, without another word, he stepped past the officers, walking away, his presence heavier than the sirens still echoing in the distance. And as he disappeared into the city he had just begun to reshape, the officers were left standing in the street, unsure of what scared them more, what they had done or what was coming next. The city didn't sleep that night. Word spread fast. Videos of the arrest flooded social media, news outlets picked up the story, and within hours, it was the only thing people were talking about. The image of the sheriff, handcuffed and humiliated by his own officers, was everywhere. The department had been under fire before, but this was different. This was national. Inside the precinct, the air was thick with tension. Officers whispered in hushed tones, glancing over their shoulders, unsure of what would happen next. The ones who had been there, the ones who had put the sheriff in cuffs, were even quieter. They knew their faces were plastered across screens. They knew their names were being discussed in rooms far above their pay grade. The captain sat in his office, his hands clasped together, staring at the desk. He had been in this department for over 20 years. He had seen scandals come and go. But this one had weight, because it wasn't just about one mistake. It was about a system that had been broken for too long, and now the wrong person had been caught in its gears. A knock on the door pulled him from his thoughts. He didn't have to look up to know who it was. "Come in," he said, his voice rough. The sheriff stepped inside, closing the door behind him. He didn't sit. He didn't need to. His presence alone was enough to fill the room. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then the sheriff exhaled, shaking his head. "You know, I expected resistance when I took this job," he said. "I expected to deal with old habits, officers who weren't ready for change." His jaw tightened. "I just didn't expect to be arrested by my own men on day one." The captain finally looked up, his face tired. "You think I wanted this to happen?" "I don't know," the sheriff said flatly. "Did you?" The captain opened his mouth, then shut it. He wanted to say no, to defend himself, to explain that this wasn't what he wanted. But the truth was, he had let this culture grow under his watch. He hadn't stopped it. And now, it was eating him alive. The sheriff studied him for a moment, then stepped closer. His voice dropped, low and firm. "You and I both know this department has been out of control for a long time." The captain didn't argue. "I'm not here to play politics," the sheriff continued. "I'm here to clean this up. And I don't care how many officers that makes uncomfortable." He let the words sink in, let them settle deep. "So the question is, are you going to help me, or are you going to be part of the problem?" The captain ran a hand over his face. He felt the weight of his years pressing down on him. This job used to be simple: follow orders, keep the department running, make sure no mess got too big. But now the mess was the department, and there was no easy way to contain it. Before he could answer, another knock came. A sergeant poked his head in, his expression uneasy. "Sir, you need to see this." Both men turned. The sheriff gave the captain a look before following the sergeant down the hall. They stepped into the main briefing room, where a handful of officers were gathered around a screen. The sheriff didn't have to ask what they were watching. It was another video, another officer, another stop gone wrong. The room was silent except for the sound of the recording, a shaky phone camera capturing a man on the ground, pleading, officers shouting over him. The date stamp in the corner showed it had happened 2 nights before. The sheriff's stomach tightened. He had been so focused on what had happened to Him that he hadn't had time to ask the bigger question. "How many more?" he said quietly. No one answered. The sergeant swallowed. "We've been getting calls all day," he admitted. "People are coming forward, saying this kind of thing has been happening for years." The sheriff took a slow breath. He had known there were problems. He had known there was corruption. But this was worse than he had imagined. He looked around the room, at the officers standing there, at the way some of them shifted uncomfortably. Some of them were nervous. Others were angry. "This is the moment," the sheriff said, his voice cutting through the room. "Right here, right now." He gestured to the screen. "Either we fix this, or we let it burn." Silence. Then a voice from the back. "What happens if we don't want to change?" The sheriff turned. The young officer from earlier, the one who had cuffed him, stood there, arms crossed. He wasn't afraid. He was defiant. The sheriff nodded slowly, like he had been waiting for this. "Then you need to turn in your badge." The officer scoffed. "You don't get to just." I do, the sheriff interrupted, his voice firm. "Because I am the law in this department now. And if you can't do the job right, you will be replaced." A beat of silence. The young officer clenched his jaw. His eyes darted around the room, looking for support, but no one spoke. The sheriff turned to the rest of them. "If you have a problem with accountability, leave now." His voice was sharp, leaving no room for doubt. "If you can't serve this city with respect, walk out that door." No one moved. The tension was suffocating. This was the breaking point. This was the moment where everything would either change or explode. And the city was watching. The room was so quiet that the hum of the fluorescent lights felt deafening. No one had moved. No one had spoken. The weight of the sheriff's words lingered in the air, heavy and unavoidable. Then the young officer, the one who had cuffed the sheriff just hours ago, let out a slow, humorless chuckle. He shook his head, glancing around at the others. "You really think you're gonna change all this?" His voice was sharp, laced with something between disbelief and resentment. "You think this department is just gonna bend because you say so?" The sheriff didn't flinch. He had faced men like this before, the ones who had worn their badge not as a duty, but as a shield. The ones who never thought the rules applied to them asterisk. "I don't need the department to bend," the sheriff said, stepping forward. "I need it to break." The young officer's smirk faltered for just a second. "That's the difference between you and me," the sheriff continued, his voice steady. "You want to hold on to the past. I'm here to tear it down." He let the words settle before delivering the final blow. "And if you've got a problem with that, maybe you should go ahead and say it now." The young officer's jaw tightened, his fingers twitched at his side. And then his radio crackled to life. "All units," a dispatcher's voice came through, the tone rushed, urgent. "We've got a disturbance at City Hall. Multiple suspects, possible riot situation, requesting immediate response." Every officer in the room instinctively reached for their radios, their training kicking in. The sheriff narrowed his eyes. He could feel it in his gut. Something wasn't right. The sergeant turned to him. "Sir, you want us to move on this?" Before the sheriff could answer, another voice came from the back of the room. "No need." Everyone turned. A man stood in the doorway, arms crossed. He wasn't in uniform. He wasn't even department personnel, but the sheriff recognized him instantly. It was the mayor's chief of staff, and if he was here, that meant this was bigger than just another call. The chief of staff stepped inside, his face unreadable. "The situation at City Hall isn't just any disturbance," he said. "It's about you." The sheriff felt a cold weight settle in his chest. The chief of staff continued, glancing around at the officers. "Protesters have gathered outside, demanding action against the officers involved in today's arrest. Some are calling for suspensions. Others," his gaze flickered toward the young officer, "they're calling for arrests." The young officer stiffened. "This is ridiculous," he muttered. The chief of staff ignored him. And that's not the worst part. He turned back to the sheriff. "We just received an anonymous tip. Someone inside this department has been leaking information, not just about today, but about a asterisk of things. Internal investigations, covered-up cases, names of officers involved." A hush fell over the room. The sheriff kept his expression unreadable, but inside, his mind was already racing. "If this information gets out the wrong way," the chief of staff continued, "it won't just be protests. It'll be a full-blown scandal. And you need to decide right now, do you want to be the man who controls this fire?" He hesitated, then added, "Or do you want to be the man who gets burned by it?" The sheriff exhaled slowly. He knew what this was. A test. A warning. A power play. And somewhere inside this very department, someone was pulling the strings. For the first time since stepping into this job, he realized his fight wasn't just with the officers in this room. It was with all of them asterisk. The sheriff stood there, absorbing everything. The protests, the leaks, the growing storm outside these walls. He had expected resistance, but now he saw the full picture. This wasn't just about a few bad officers. This was about a system that had been rotting from the inside for years. The young officer shifted uncomfortably. "So what? You're saying someone's trying to take us all down?" His voice held a mix of anger and fear. "No," the sheriff said calmly. "I'm saying someone's finally telling the truth." The room tensed. The weight of those words settled deep, pressing into every officer who had ever looked the other way, covered for a partner, let a report disappear. Some of them clenched their jaws, their defenses rising. Others avoided eye contact, knowing they had played their own part in this mess. Then the sergeant's radio crackled again. "Units, be advised, protest at City Hall is escalating. Suspects moving toward the precinct, requesting immediate assistance." The sheriff turned to the chief of staff. "Who leaked the files?" The chief of staff hesitated. "We don't know yet, but it's someone high up in the department, someone with access." The sheriff's pulse quickened. That meant it wasn't just some low-level officer trying to expose corruption. This was deliberate, strategic. Someone was pushing this moment to the edge. Before he could process it further, the front doors of the precinct burst open. A small group of protesters had made it inside, their voices rising in anger. Officers moved quickly, trying to contain the situation, but the energy was volatile. A woman stepped forward, her eyes locked onto the sheriff. "How are you still protecting them?" she shouted, her voice filled with frustration. "After everything they did to you, after everything they've done to us, you're still standing here with them." The sheriff exhaled. He understood their anger. He had felt their anger. But if he let emotions take over now, everything would spiral. "I'm not here to protect bad cops," he said firmly. "I'm here to expose them." The room went silent. Even the officers froze.